For more than 600 years, the Habsburg family stood at the center of Europe. Their empire stretched across mountains, rivers, kingdoms, and cultures. They crowned emperors, shaped wars, and influenced the future of an entire continent. For generations, it looked like their power would never end. Then, almost overnight, it did. In just a few weeks in 1918, the empire they had spent centuries building fell apart. The crowns were gone. The palaces no longer belonged to them. Their armies disappeared, their wealth was seized, and the family that had once ruled millions suddenly had no country to call home. Most people think that's where the story ends, but it isn't. What happened next is even more surprising. The Habsburgs didn't simply vanish into history. They survived exile, poverty, political chaos, and even the rise of Hitler. Instead of disappearing, they found new ways to matter in a world that no longer wanted kings. So how does a family lose an empire and still manage to shape Europe more than a century later? The answer isn't just about history. It's about what people choose to do after losing everything. It's hard to imagine today, but there was a time when the Habsburg family was one of the most powerful dynasties on earth. For more than 6 centuries, they weren't just another royal family. They ruled an empire that stretched across much of Europe. Their lands reached from what is now Belgium all the way to the edge of the Ottoman Empire. They governed people who spoke different languages, followed different traditions, and came from completely different cultures. Generation after generation, the Habsburgs produced emperors, kings, queens, and political leaders who shaped the future of Europe. Their influence reached almost every major royal court on the continent. At one point, it seemed like no important decision could be made without the Habsburg name being part of it. From the outside, their empire looked almost impossible to break. It had survived wars, rebellions, economic crises, and constant political pressure. As one ruler passed away, another stepped in. The dynasty just kept going, century after century. To many people, it felt permanent, like it had always existed and always would. But history has a way of reminding us that nothing lasts forever. By the early 1900s, the empire was still enormous, but cracks had already started to show beneath the surface. The different national groups living inside the empire wanted more freedom. Many wanted their own governments. Old political systems that had worked for generations were beginning to struggle in a rapidly changing world. Then came World War I. The war pushed every weakness to its limit. What had once been a stable empire suddenly found itself dealing with military defeats, economic hardship, food shortages, and growing unrest from nearly every direction. In 1916, after Emperor Franz Joseph died following an extraordinary 68 years on the throne, a young man named Karl unexpectedly became emperor. He was only 31 years old. He had never expected to wear the crown, and he inherited an empire that was already beginning to fall apart. Karl didn't create the crisis. He simply became the man standing at the top when everything started collapsing around him. And that was only the beginning of a story that would completely change the future of one of Europe's greatest royal families. When Karl became emperor, he didn't inherit a strong and stable country. He inherited a crisis that had already been growing for years. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was made up of more than a dozen different ethnic groups. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Poles, Italians, and many others all lived under the same crown. They spoke different languages, followed different traditions, and many of them wanted more control over their own future. Keeping all of those groups united had never been easy. But World War I pushed everything to the breaking point. The fighting dragged on year after year. Soldiers were dying in huge numbers. Food became harder to find. Prices kept rising. Families struggled just to get through everyday life. At the same time, military defeats kept piling up, and confidence in the government faded. Karl understood that the empire couldn't survive if the war continued. He wasn't interested in endless fighting. He wanted peace. So he quietly reached out to the Allied powers through members of his wife's family, hoping to negotiate a separate peace agreement. It was a bold move, and probably his best chance to save what was left of the empire. Instead, it backfired. The negotiations became public, embarrassing Karl in front of Germany, his most important ally. At the same time, they failed to convince Britain or France to make a deal. He ended up losing trust on both sides without gaining anything in return. After that, events moved faster than anyone could stop. By the fall of 1918, the empire was unraveling almost day by day. National movements that had been waiting for years finally declared independence. Czechoslovakia became a republic. Hungary broke away. Poland returned as an independent nation. South Slavic territories began forming what would later become Yugoslavia. The army that had once protected one of Europe's largest empires was falling apart. Soldiers deserted. Government officials lost control. The system that had survived for centuries was collapsing from every direction at once. Karl wasn't watching a temporary political setback. He was watching an entire world disappear right in front of him. By November 1918, there wasn't much left to save. The empire had fallen apart. One region after another had declared independence. The government was losing control, and the old system that had held Europe together for centuries was gone. Karl knew the war was over. He also knew he no longer had the power to rule. On November 11, the same day the fighting ended on the Western Front, he signed a document that changed the course of his family's future. But here's the part that made all the difference. Karl never officially gave up the throne. Instead of abdicating, he signed a statement saying he would no longer take part in the affairs of the state. It may sound like a small legal detail, but to Karl it meant everything. In his mind, stepping aside was not the same as surrendering his right to rule. That decision would follow him for the rest of his life. The new Republican government saw things very differently. As far as they were concerned, the monarchy was finished. There was no place for an emperor who still believed he had a claim to the throne. That evening, Karl and his wife Zita quietly left Schönbrunn Palace for the last time. There were no cheering crowds, no royal ceremony, no grand farewell. They simply drove away through the quiet streets of Vienna, leaving behind the palace that had been the heart of Habsburg power for generations. Their destination was a hunting lodge outside the city. It wasn't a home. It was more like a waiting room for an uncertain future. Life there was cold, uncomfortable, and filled with uncertainty. Food was limited, the building was poorly heated, and government officials kept a close watch on the family. They had lost their authority, but they hadn't yet been formally forced into exile. The situation felt especially dangerous because everyone still remembered what had happened to Russia's Romanov family just a few months earlier. The fear that Karl and his family could face a similar fate was very real. Concern over their safety became so serious that the British government sent Lieutenant Colonel Edward Lyle Strutt to help protect them. His presence likely prevented the situation from becoming far worse. For the Habsburg family, losing the empire had been devastating. But the hardest part was still waiting just around the corner. The worst part didn't happen when Karl left the palace. It happened a few months later. On the 3rd of April, 1919, Austria's new government passed what became known as the Habsburg Law. It wasn't just another political decision. It was meant to erase the Habsburgs from public life. Karl was permanently banned from returning to Austria. Other members of the family could only come back if they officially gave up every claim to the throne and accepted life as ordinary citizens. But losing their titles wasn't the biggest blow. The government also took almost everything they owned. The palaces that had been in the family for centuries were gone. The estates were gone. Their priceless art collections, libraries, and historic treasures were all transferred to the new Austrian state. Schönbrunn Palace, the Hofburg, and countless other symbols of imperial power were no longer theirs. Imagine waking up one day and finding out that your family home belongs to someone else. Everything your ancestors spent generations building is gone. You're told you can never come back unless you deny your own family's history. That was the reality the Habsburgs faced. Fortunately for Karl and his family, they had already left Austria just before the law took effect. With the help of British officer Edward Lyle Strutt, they boarded the former imperial train and crossed into Switzerland. But even then, Karl wasn't ready to let go. Just before reaching the border, he issued the Feldkirch Manifesto, declaring that he withdrew his earlier statement and still considered himself the rightful ruler. Then he changed out of his military uniform, put on civilian clothes, and crossed into Switzerland as a man without a country. The message was clear. He had lost his empire, but not his belief that he was still emperor. Switzerland gave the family a place to stay, but it wasn't a permanent solution. They first lived in a castle owned by relatives, then moved farther away after the Swiss government grew uncomfortable with having the former emperor so close to Austria. At the same time, their financial situation kept getting worse. The payments that had been promised by the former empire's successor states never arrived. Karl and Zita were left trying to support a growing family with whatever private money they had managed to take with them. Little by little, they began selling family jewels, artwork, and valuables just to cover everyday expenses. The family that had once ruled millions of people was now living off the last pieces of its past, hoping they could somehow build a future from what little remained. Even after losing his empire, Karl refused to believe the story was over. He still saw himself as the rightful king, especially in Hungary. Unlike Austria, Hungary had never officially abolished its monarchy. Instead, Admiral Miklos Horthy was serving as regent, ruling in the king's place. Karl believed that if he returned, everything would fall back into place. In the spring of 1921, he quietly traveled to Hungary for his first attempt. He met with Horthy face to face, convinced that loyalty to the crown would outweigh politics. He expected the regent to step aside and allow him to reclaim the throne. That never happened. Horthy refused. He argued that bringing Karl back would throw the region into chaos. Neighboring countries were already watching closely, and there were real fears that a restoration could trigger military action. Whether Horthy truly believed that or simply wanted to stay in power is still debated today. Either way, Karl left empty-handed. Most people would have accepted defeat after that. Karl didn't. A few months later, in October 1921, he tried again. This time, he came back with a small group of loyal supporters. They gathered in western Hungary and began moving toward Budapest, hoping more soldiers and civilians would join them along the way. For a brief moment, it looked like history might take an unexpected turn. But the momentum didn't last. Horthy's forces stood their ground. After a short military clash outside Budapest, Karl's supporters were defeated before they could reach the capital. Realizing that continuing the fight would only cost more lives, Karl surrendered. It was the end of his final chance to regain the crown. After 2 failed attempts, the Allied powers decided they had seen enough. As long as Karl remained anywhere in Central Europe, they believed he would continue trying to restore the monarchy and keep the region unstable, so they removed him completely. Karl, Zita, and their children were placed aboard the British cruiser HMS Cardiff. Even the crew didn't know where they were going until the ship was already at sea. Their destination was Madeira, a small Portuguese island deep in the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't officially called a prison, but in reality, they had nowhere else to go. The family arrived with almost no money and very little hope. The treasures they had managed to save had already been sold to finance Karl's failed efforts to reclaim his throne. The emperor, who had once ruled more than 50 million people, was now beginning a new life in exile, farther from his homeland than he had ever imagined and with almost nothing left to his name. Madeira was supposed to be a place where Karl could quietly live out the rest of his life. Instead, it became the place where his story came to an end. At first, the family stayed in an expensive hotel they couldn't possibly afford. Before long, they had to move into a much simpler villa in the hills above Funchal. It was beautiful from a distance, but living there was far from easy. The house was damp, poorly insulated, and money was running out fast. By then, almost everything they had brought into exile was gone. The artwork, jewelry, and other valuables that had survived the collapse of the empire had already been sold. Some of it paid for everyday living expenses. The rest had gone toward Karl's 2 failed attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne. There was very little left. Life had become a daily struggle for a family that had once lived in imperial palaces. Then Karl became sick. In early March of 1922, what seemed like a simple cold quickly turned into bronchitis. Before long, it developed into severe pneumonia. His health had already been weakened by previous battles with the Spanish flu, and this time his body simply couldn't recover. On the 1st of April 1922, Karl died. He was only 34 years old. His wife, Zita, was by his side. So was their oldest son, 9-year-old Otto. The boy who had grown up expecting to inherit one of Europe's greatest dynasties instead watched his father die in exile, far from the country their family had ruled for centuries. Just 4 days later, Karl was buried in a small church in Funchal. There were no imperial ceremonies, no grand military procession, no crowds lining the streets of Vienna. The man who had once ruled an empire of more than 50 million people was laid to rest on a quiet island in the Atlantic, thousands of miles from the Habsburg rulers buried before him. Even after his death, the exile continued. Austria refused to allow Karl's remains to be moved to the imperial crypt in Vienna, where generations of Habsburg emperors had been buried for more than 300 years. In many ways, that final decision said everything about how completely the old empire had disappeared. But Karl's death wasn't the end of the Habsburg story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a completely different chapter that would be carried forward by a 9-year-old boy named Otto. Karl was gone, but the Habsburg story wasn't over. Before he died, Empress Zita leaned over to their oldest son, Otto, and quietly told him something that would shape the rest of his life. She said his father was now at peace, and that he was now the emperor and king. Otto was only 9 years old. Think about that for a second. Most kids that age are worried about school or playing with friends. Otto had just watched his father die in exile, and suddenly the weight of a dynasty that had ruled Europe for more than 600 years was placed on his shoulders. Of course, there was no empire left to rule. No palace, no army, no throne waiting for him. But to his mother, that didn't matter. She believed the Habsburg legacy was still alive, and she was determined to make sure her son never forgot it. Zita was only 29 when Karl died. She was raising 8 children with very little money and no permanent home. Life could have broken her. Instead, she became the person who held the family together. She raised Otto with the same discipline that had shaped generations of Habsburg rulers. His education followed the traditions of the old imperial court. Tutors from Austria, England, and France taught him history, politics, religion, and languages. He grew up speaking several languages and learned to think far beyond the borders of any single country, but this wasn't about preparing him to wear a crown. It was about preparing him to carry an identity that most people believed had already disappeared. The family continued moving from one country to another during those difficult years. Eventually, they settled in northern Spain after a group of Spanish nobles helped provide them with a home. For the first time since leaving Austria, they had something that felt a little more stable. As Otto grew older, he became deeply interested in history and politics. He later studied at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, using a different name, and earned a doctorate in political and social sciences in 1935. He wasn't spending his life dreaming about the past. He was trying to understand the future. That timing couldn't have been more important. Because while Otto was building his education, another powerful figure was rising in Europe. A man whose vision for the continent left no room for the Habsburg family. His name was Adolf Hitler. And before long, Otto would find himself facing a threat far greater than exile. As Otto was building his future, Europe was falling apart again. This time, the threat wasn't the collapse of an empire. It was Adolf Hitler. To Hitler, the Habsburg family represented everything he wanted to erase. They stood for a multi-ethnic Europe where different cultures and languages existed under one political system. That vision was completely opposite to the one Hitler was trying to build. When it became clear that Nazi Germany planned to take over Austria, Otto made an unexpected offer. He volunteered to return from exile and lead Austria as a symbol of resistance. He believed that restoring the Habsburg monarchy could unite the country against Hitler. But the Austrian government turned him down. Its leaders feared that bringing Otto back would only make the situation worse and give Hitler another excuse to invade. Not long afterward, those fears became reality. In March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria. One of Hitler's first moves was to bring back the Habsburg law that had once driven the family into exile. Their remaining property was confiscated again. The little they had managed to preserve was taken away once more. For Otto, the danger became personal. The Nazi regime sentenced him to death in absentia. He was officially declared an enemy of the state and branded a traitor to the German people. If he had been captured, he almost certainly would not have survived. So once again, the Habsburg family had to run. With the help of Portuguese diplomat Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who risked his own career by issuing visas to refugees fleeing the Nazis, Otto escaped Europe and eventually reached the United States. But exile didn't silence him. From America, Otto threw himself into the fight against Nazi Germany. He met with Allied leaders, including President Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. He argued that Austria should be recognized as a victim of Nazi aggression rather than a willing partner in Hitler's expansion. He used every connection and every bit of influence his family name still carried to support the Allied cause. Meanwhile, not every member of the Habsburg family managed to escape. Those who remained in Europe faced constant danger. Family properties were seized, personal belongings disappeared, and anyone connected to anti-Nazi activity risked imprisonment or even death. The family that had already lost an empire now found itself fighting for something even more basic. Not a throne, not power, simply the chance to survive another war. When World War II finally came to an end, the Nazis were gone. But for the Habsburgs, the road home was still far from over. When World War II ended, you might think the Habsburg family could finally go home. They couldn't. Austria was free again, but the laws that had forced the Habsburgs into exile were still in place. The new government had no interest in bringing back the old monarchy. In fact, when Austria regained full sovereignty in 1955, it agreed to keep those anti-Habsburg laws. The Soviet Union strongly supported that decision, making it clear that any return of the monarchy was out of the question. For Otto, it was a painful reality. He was the head of one of Europe's oldest royal families, yet he still wasn't allowed to set foot in the country his ancestors had ruled for centuries. For years, the debate over his return divided Austrian politics. Some believed history should stay in the past. Others thought it was finally time to move on. Otto eventually realized something important. If he kept fighting for a throne that no longer existed, he'd spend the rest of his life chasing the past. So, in 1961, he made a decision that surprised a lot of people. He officially gave up every claim to political power and declared himself a loyal citizen of the Austrian Republic. It wasn't because he had forgotten his family's history. It was because he understood that history alone couldn't build the future. Even after making that declaration, he still had to wait. It wasn't until 1966, after a political shift in Austria, that Otto was finally allowed to return. Nearly half a century had passed since his family had been forced out. His first visit wasn't a political rally. He didn't demand his crown back. He didn't call for the monarchy to be restored. Instead, he quietly traveled to Innsbruck to visit the grave of a family member. It was a deeply personal moment, but it also marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. By then, Otto's priorities had completely changed. He no longer believed Europe's future depended on kings or empires. What mattered now was cooperation between nations. The old Habsburg Empire had brought many different peoples together under one political system. It had been far from perfect, but Otto believed one lesson still mattered. Central Europe was stronger when its countries worked together instead of fighting each other. Rather than trying to rebuild the empire his family had lost, Otto devoted himself to building something entirely different. Not an empire held together by crowns, but a Europe held together by partnership. That new mission would define the rest of his life and give the Habsburg name a very different place in modern history. By the late 1960s, Otto had stopped looking backward. He wasn't trying to rebuild the Habsburg Empire anymore. Instead, he focused on something he believed could prevent Europe from repeating its darkest mistakes: a united Europe. To Otto, the idea wasn't all that different from what his family had once tried to hold together. The old empire had brought together people with different languages, cultures, and traditions under one political system. It had plenty of flaws, but it also showed that cooperation was possible. Now, he believed democracy could do what monarchy no longer could. For years, Otto worked with the Pan-European Movement, an organization that promoted closer cooperation among European nations. In 1973, he became its president, a position he held for more than 30 years. His influence continued to grow. After becoming a German citizen, Otto was elected to the European Parliament in 1979. He would remain there for the next 20 years, becoming one of the strongest voices for European unity. Inside Parliament, he made it clear that Europe wasn't truly united as long as millions of people remained trapped behind the Iron Curtain. One of his first symbolic acts was placing an empty chair in the chamber. It represented the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that were still living under communist rule. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a powerful message. Then came one of the most remarkable moments of Otto's life. In August 1989, he helped support an event known as the Pan-European Picnic along the border between Austria and Hungary. The plan seemed almost symbolic. Border gates would open for a short time as a peaceful demonstration of cooperation between East and West. No one expected what happened next. Hundreds of East Germans rushed through the opening, crossing into Austria on their way to freedom. The Hungarian border guards, despite having orders that could have led to violence, chose not to stop them. That single moment became the first major breach in the Iron Curtain. Within months, thousands more followed. Pressure kept building until November 1989, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, changing the future of Europe forever. Years later, East German leader Erich Honecker reportedly blamed Otto, saying that this Habsburg had driven the nail into his coffin. It was an extraordinary twist of history. The man who never regained his family's throne helped reshape Europe in a completely different way. Not through armies, not through royal power, but through diplomacy, cooperation, and the belief that Europe's future depended on nations working together instead of standing apart. By the time Otto passed away in 2011, he had spent decades proving that the Habsburg name could still matter, even without an empire. Leadership of the family then passed to his son, Karl von Habsburg. Unlike his ancestors, Karl wasn't born into a world of royal courts or imperial politics. He grew up in a modern Europe, where influence came through public service rather than inherited power. He studied law, philosophy, and political science, completed military service in Austria, and later followed his father into the European Parliament. But his biggest contribution came in a very different field. From 2008 to 2020, Karl served as president of Blue Shield International, an organization dedicated to protecting cultural heritage during wars and natural disasters. You can think of it as something similar to the Red Cross, except its mission is to protect history instead of people. For someone carrying the Habsburg name, the role made perfect sense. His family had spent centuries building and preserving European culture. Now, instead of ruling over it, he was helping protect it. In 2026, Karl reached another symbolic milestone when he met with Czech President Petr Pavel at Prague Castle. It was the first official meeting between a Czech president and a member of the former Habsburg ruling family. More than a century after the empire collapsed, two sides once divided by history were finally sitting down together. The next generation has taken an even different path. Karl's oldest son, Ferdinand von Habsburg, didn't become a politician or a military leader. Instead, he chose professional motorsports, building a career as a racing driver in endurance competitions across Europe. It's probably the last profession anyone would expect for the great-grandson of an emperor. But in many ways, that's exactly what makes the Habsburg story so remarkable. The family no longer rules countries, but it never completely disappeared. Different branches still own private property, investments, businesses, and valuable art collections across Europe. While the exact size of their wealth remains private, their influence today goes far beyond money. Many family members continue working in philanthropy, cultural preservation, and public life. Since 2011, they have even been legally eligible to run for Austria's presidency, a remarkable turnaround for a family that was once permanently banned from returning to the country. Looking back, it's amazing how much changed in just over a century. The Habsburgs lost their empire. They lost their palaces. They lost their political power. But they never lost the ability to adapt. And maybe that's the biggest reason their story is still being told today. Not because they once ruled Europe, but because they found a way to stay relevant long after their empire became history. When people hear the story of the Habsburgs, it's easy to focus on what they lost. They lost an empire that had stood for more than 600 years. They lost their palaces, their wealth, their political power, and even the right to live in their own country. For a while, it looked like history had completely erased them, but that's not what actually happened. Instead of spending generation after generation chasing a throne they could never get back, they slowly found new ways to contribute. Otto dedicated his life to a more united Europe. Karl focused on protecting cultural heritage. The next generation built lives that looked nothing like the ones their ancestors had lived. That's what makes this story worth remembering. Real influence doesn't always come from titles or crowns. Sometimes it comes from adapting when life forces you to change. The Habsburgs couldn't control what happened to their empire, but they could control what they did next. And maybe that's the lesson that still matters today. No matter how successful someone is, nothing stays the same forever. Careers change, institutions disappear, entire countries can be transformed. The real question isn't whether change will come, it always does. The question is what you'll choose to do after everything changes. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more forgotten moments that shape the world we live in today, I'd really appreciate your support. Subscribe to Forgotten Code, leave a comment with your thoughts, and let me know which historical story you'd like to explore next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.